What if I told you that the Pope who refused thrones, stood up to dictators, washed the feet of immigrants and defied the oldest traditions of the Church, almost died before he even discovered his calling? What if behind that calm smile, there was a silent storm of dangerous decisions, internal crises, and invisible battles that almost no one dares to tell about? Today, you will delve into the story of the man who became a symbol of simplicity on one of the most powerful thrones on the planet. We will go back in time to the childhood of Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the boy from Buenos Aires, who faced death at the age of 21 and was reborn with an invisible mission. We will follow his radical decision to abandon science to serve the forgotten, and how he survived the dark years of the Argentine dictatorship, where faith and fear walked side by side. You will see how a bishop on a bus with worn-out shoes and his own pot ended up in the center of the Vatican, and why the choice of the name Francis was not just symbolic, it was an earthquake. We will explore his internal struggles with abuse within the Church, his physical pain in the face of time, and the challenge of holding firm to his faith while whispering behind the scenes. Who will be next? This is not just the story of a religious leader. It is the saga of an ordinary man who became a beacon for a world in crisis. So get ready, because by the end of this video, you will not see Pope Francis in the same light. Watch it now, share it with anyone who needs to hear this story, and if you don't follow the channel yet, take the opportunity to join this journey of faith, courage, and humanity. When silence spoke louder than the world. It was an ordinary summer day in Buenos Aires, but the heat did not come from the sun. It came from the racing heart of a skinny boy with a curious gaze and a restless soul. Jorge Mario Bergoglio, the eldest son of a simple family of Italian immigrants, grew up surrounded by books, the smell of pasta at lunch, and whispers of an Argentina that was teeming between its European past and its uncertain future. But even amid the noise of the city, there was something about him that only silence seemed to understand. As a child, Jorge did not stand out for being the loudest, the most popular, or the most daring of the group. He was the one who listened. He listened to the stories of his grandmother Rosa, a woman of unbreakable faith. He listened to the groans of the poor around the neighborhood of Flores, and he listened, above all, to that invisible call that whispered to him in moments of solitude. It was as if eternity itself, disguised as a breeze, played with the back of his neck as he walked alone to the nearest church. But it was at the age of 21, between life and death, that everything changed. A severe, almost fatal respiratory infection left him hospitalized. The doctors doubted him. He didn't. And there, on the edge of the abyss, with half of one lung compromised, he made a promise. If he got out alive, his life would no longer be his. It was the first time that eternity responded in kind. Jorge survived. And not only that, he was reborn, as if every cell in his body had been reprogrammed for a greater purpose. It was in this silent rebirth that the desire to serve was born, but not as a priest with a golden altar. He wanted the people, the mud, the invisible. From that moment on, something inside him began to move with force. He abandoned his plans as a scientist and began to look at the world with a burning urgency. And it was precisely in this inner fire that he would take the next step, a leap that would take him from chemical equations to the mysteries of the soul, from the laboratory to the cassock, renouncing the world. Anyone who saw Jorge in a white lab coat, surrounded by test tubes and complex formulas, would probably never have imagined what was going on behind that focused gaze. At that time, the young Bergoglio was a promising chemical technician, graduated from an industrial college. His steady and precise hands measured substances with almost surgical rigor, but his heart, that one operated on a different frequency. While his colleagues were fascinated by chemical reactions, he was distracted by the human dramas hidden between the lines of life. A grumpy clerk, a beggar on the sidewalk, the silence of a mother in line at the supermarket. All of this affected him in a strange way, as if each anonymous face carried a call. It wasn't overnight that he exchanged the physical world for the spiritual. It was a process, a growing discomfort, a kind of nausea of logic, as if exact answers no longer explained anything. And so in 1958, at the age of 21, he did the unthinkable. He entered the novitiate of the Society of Jesus, the famous and demanding Jesuits. The decision came as a bolt from the blue among friends and family, to give up stability, a salary, and the dreams of his youth to live chastity, poverty, and obedience. Only a madman would do that, or a visionary, but Jorge didn't want a priesthood of stained glass windows and smiling altar boys. He wanted the abyss. He wanted to understand the human soul like a surgeon understands the body, from the inside. And the Jesuits, with their intellectual rigor and almost military discipline, offered him the most difficult path, and for that very reason, the most fascinating. For years he studied philosophy, theology, literature, and languages. He passed through Santiago de Chile, Madrid, and Rome, absorbing the world without breaking the silence. It was as if each page read, each rule obeyed, was forging something inside him, something that didn't yet have a name, but already carried weight. And it was during this long, demanding, and solitary journey that he learned to recognize others not by their titles or appearances, but by their pain and desire for meaning. This lens, honed by experience, would soon be put to the test, at a time when Argentina was bleeding, and faith would be tested by fire. Argentina between dictatorships and faith, a priest in dark times. On December 13, 1969, Jorge Mario Bergoglio was ordained a priest. The ceremony was discreet without pomp. He wore white, but the world around him was plunged into the densest of grays. Argentina was entering one of its darkest phases. The years of lead, military coups, kidnappings, disappearances, censorship. Fear lurked around every corner, and faith needed to learn to walk in silent shoes. It was a time when a word could cost a life, when yesterday's friend could disappear without a trace. In this oppressive scenario, Bergoglio was appointed provincial of the Jesuits in Argentina in 1973, the youngest in history, at just 36 years old. Suddenly, the shy young man found himself in the eye of the storm, leading men of faith at a time when silence could save or condemn. And then began the most controversial part of his career. Some say he was prudent, others accuse him of neglect. He removed seminarians from risk areas, hid persecuted priests, and negotiated with the military. But there are also reports of priests who were arrested and tortured, and who claim they were not protected by him. The truth, like an old mirror, reflects cracks, and Bergoglio carries these cracks in his chest to this day. He was not the kind of priest who shouted in the squares. He was the one who went into cells, the one who prayed inside, a leader who knew that sometimes saving a soul required keeping his mouth shut and moving the pieces behind the curtain. His eyes learned to read between the lines more than texts. And it was precisely this ability to navigate murky waters that shaped him, not as a martyr, nor as a hero, but as a man deeply aware of human fragility. But while the country was still mourning its lost children, and the church was trying to wash the blood from its hands without losing the ring in the process, Jorge was gaining another reputation, that of someone who did not forget, someone who wrote down the names of the victims, one by one, as if they were unfinished prayers. And it was precisely this look that would accompany him when, years later, he began to rise in office, not because of a desire for power, but because he had learned, in the most painful way possible, that authority, when it does not serve to protect the weak, turns into tyranny. And it was in this tension that, with firm steps and a restless soul, he was led to pastor an entire city, which burned with inequality. When Buenos Aires became a pulpit and a cross, it was winter in 1992 when Jorge Mario Bergoglio was appointed auxiliary bishop of Buenos Aires. The cold bit the skin of those who slept under tarps and cardboard on the streets of the Argentine capital. But inside the churches, oh, there the heat came from somewhere else. And it wasn't from the candles. It was from him, from the priest with the hoarse voice and hurried steps, who refused to be just another name on the wall of the curia. He was a bishop outside the mold, and for that very reason, impossible to ignore. In the southern part of the city, where sewage ran in the open air and children ran around barefoot, Bergoglio arrived without fanfare, by bus, with a worn briefcase and the same old coat. He sat on the sidewalks, listened to mothers, blessed drug addicts, ate whatever they gave him, his dirty cassock, worn shoes, and an iron cross on his chest, which seemed more like a daily reminder that his Christ did not live in palaces, but among the marginalized. In 1998, the whole city knew he was now the archbishop, but anyone who thought that this would distance him from the people was mistaken. He refused to live in the episcopal palace and remained in the same modest apartment, cooking his own rice and washing his own dishes. He slept little, he walked a lot, and above all he observed. Because for him, pastoring was more about seeing than talking. He saw abandonment in the eyes of the elderly. He saw hunger in their calloused hands. He saw God in places where no one else looked. It was at this time that he began to shape his theology of the periphery, a way of seeing the world from the bottom up. For Bergoglio, the gospel was not a manual of good manners, but a silent revolution that began with a hug and ended with a plate of food. And while the ecclesiastical halls awaited diplomatic speeches, he spoke of injustice with an almost prophetic indignation. Buenos Aires, accustomed to politicians promising heaven at election time, found it strange that this priest promised only presence. It was this lively, restless, and at times disconcerting presence that soon drew attention beyond Argentina's borders. Rome watched. The Vatican listened. And even if they didn't say it out loud, there were already those who whispered in the sacred corridors that this poor archbishop, with his sharp eyes, might one day wear white. The cardinal who didn't suit. Rome is made of marble, gold, and protocols, an ancient choreography where each step has its time and each word its weight. When Jorge Mario Bergoglio was named a cardinal by St. John Paul II on February 21, 2001, it seemed as if the ritual had absorbed yet another name. But the Vatican would soon realize that the name did not bend as easily as the vestments suggested. While other cardinals posed for photos in their crisp scarlet capes, Bergoglio boarded the plane back to Buenos Aires with the same worn suitcase and an even more determined look in his eyes. He refused the limousine. You preferred the bus. He returned the lavish banquet invitations. He said he preferred to eat with the poor than to drink wine with princes of the church. And no one really knew if that was genuine humility or holy provocation. In Rome, this sounded almost like aesthetic heresy. A cardinal who washed his own clothes, who refused to wear a gold cross, who didn't hire secretaries and went to the supermarket on foot. It was as if a fisherman had entered a gala ball and instead of dancing, began to dismantle the stage with a smile on his face. But Bergoglio wasn't joking. He knew the power. Yes, I knew how it worked. He knew about the games, the intrigues, the struggles for influence. But unlike so many others, he didn't want to play. I wanted to subvert the board. While some sought to climb the hierarchy as if climbing a marble staircase, he took the opposite path. He descended. For him, ecclesiastical authority was not a throne. It was a floor. And it was on this ground that he began to tread more firmly, in the poor neighborhoods, in the fields, in the prisons. Each visit, a gesture. Every gesture, a message. And this message began to echo louder than many speeches read with pomp in the halls of the Vatican. But none of this protected him from the growing discomfort in some sectors of the Curia. After all, a cardinal who spoke little but talked a lot was a risk. And that risk would increase unexpectedly when, in 2013, a silent earthquake would shake the church and change the course of history forever. The resignation that opened the door to the impossible. It was February 11, 2013. While the world went about its distracted routine, the Vatican was preparing for an announcement that no one, absolutely no one, expected. Benedict XVI, the theologian pope, the man of impeccable liturgy and unshakable reason, was resigning from the throne of Peter. For the first time in almost 600 years, a pope had left office of his own free will. What had previously seemed unthinkable now took on the appearance of a prophecy, and behind the scenes, something even greater was already moving. The next conclave became a silent stage of tension and expectation. Cardinals from all over the world gathered in the Sistine Chapel, while outside the faithful looked up at the chimney of doubt, waiting for the color of the smoke, as if the course of faith depended on it. And then on March 13, 2013, at the end of a cold and rainy afternoon in Rome, the white smoke rose. The people applauded, but the name that echoed immediately afterwards left the world in suspense. Habemus Papam, Franciscum. Francis? No one expected Jorge Mario Bergoglio, a Jesuit, a Latin American, the first pope from the Americas, the first from the Society of Jesus. And on top of that, the first to choose the name of the poor man from Assisi, a gesture loaded with symbolism, which in itself already drew a whole map of what was to come. When he appeared on the balcony of St. Peter's Basilica, his simplicity disarmed even the most skeptical. No blessing before being blessed, no ostentation, just a buonasera and a humble request for prayer. But beneath the lightness of that wave there was a silent earthquake. That man, with his tired eyes and discreet smile, was about to turn the church inside out, not by force, but by presence. And in the days that followed, it became clear, Pope Francis did not come with prepared speeches. He came with gestures that spoke louder than encyclicals. He exchanged the palace for a simple room. He refused the golden throne, preferring the wooden chair. He took off his gold ring and put the iron cross on his finger, and each of these acts, which seemed like details, were in fact the harbinger of a revolution. Because the new pope not only dressed differently, he thought differently, and his ideas would begin to spread like the wind, taking with them old certainties, shaking up traditions, and planting the seeds of a new era that no one yet knew how to name. The pope who traded thrones for worn-out shoes. In the first few weeks of his pontificate, the world understood. This was not a pope like the others. Francis did not need decrees to make this clear. The details were enough, and it was precisely in these that he began his silent revolution. While the golden corridors of the Vatican still echoed with the footsteps of centuries of pomp, Francis preferred to wear worn-out black shoes and walk slowly without making a fuss. But each step he took seemed to scream. He stayed away from the apostolic palace, the symbol of papal power, and chose to live in the modest Casa Santa Marta, not out of whim, but out of conviction. He wanted to live among the priests, eat lunch in the common dining room, and smell the people. He refused the limousine and continued to drive the same Ford Focus as before, small, simple, almost invisible. And that, coming from a pope, was an almost subversive act. Francis never needed to raise his voice to challenge. His manner was that of a living metaphor. The silver fisherman's ring, the iron pectoral cross, the absence of the exuberant vestments, each choice a crack in the marble of tradition. He was giving the church back a human, earthy, accessible face, a face that smiled with wrinkles, that spoke with a southern accent, that embraced in a hurry, as if it were time. But it was not just appearance. His way of governing would soon reveal something even deeper, an ecclesial vision of decentralization, of listening, of active presence. In his morning homilies, in his prison visits, in his personal phone calls to the faithful who wrote him letters, Francis shortened distances with a gesture that Rome had long forgotten, that of being there. And this presence began to bother. Traditionalists grumbled. The more rigid sectors of the Curia turned up their noses. After all, what kind of pope breaks protocol to wash the feet of immigrants, Muslims, and women? What kind of pontiff openly says, "Who am I to judge?" when talking about homosexuals? What kind of leader opens windows where there have always been walls? Francis did not answer. He kept walking, one step at a time, one gesture at a time. And as his figure spread throughout the world like wind in an empty cathedral, a new question began to form between the lines of his papacy. If he spoke so much about mercy, was it the true center of the faith he wanted to rescue? Mercy, the thread that weaves his doctrine. The word was old, but in Francis's mouth it sounded new, alive, urgent, non-negotiable. Mercy, for him it was not just a virtue to be admired, but a verb to be lived. An invisible thread that should stitch together every corner of the church, from the confessional to the pulpit, from the sacristies to the forgotten corners of big cities. In 2015, he surprised the world by announcing the extraordinary Jubilee of Mercy, a holy year beginning on December 8th of that year. But he was not content with opening the holy doors of the great basilicas. He ordered every parish on the planet to open theirs. It was a symbolic gesture, of course, but it was also a theological earthquake. He said, "The church cannot be a customs house of grace, but a field hospital after the battle." He washed the feet of prisoners, including Muslims, women, and even atheists. He visited refugee camps, embraced victims of abuse, and forgave public scandals. He allowed priests to absolve people of abortion in confession, something unheard of until then. And when he reached out to divorced and remarried people, Francis was not rewriting doctrines. He was recalling the face of the gospel, the one who got dirty in the mud to reach out to others. But mercy, for him, was not blind indulgence. It was compassion with firmness, a love that demands responsibility. And this put him on dangerous ground, between those who thought he was too liberal and those who thought he was too radical. The conservative wing of the church accused him of ambiguity. They said he confused sheep and opened up too many loopholes. But Francis kept going, without a shield, without a sword, just a tired smile and a look that had seen too much pain to be bothered by noise. His writings, such as the 2016 exhortation Amoris Laetitia, built bridges where before there were only walls. For him, the truth should never be a stone in his hand. And this way of shepherding with empathy, of correcting with tenderness, of dialoguing with those who were different, made headlines, divided opinions, and attracted crowds. But it also revealed something deeper. Francis did not want to reform the church from the outside. He wanted to heal it from the inside. And perhaps that was why, in his next mission, he would turn his gaze not only to individual sins, but to the collective sin that threatened all of creation, and that called for a new conversion, a green conversion. Ecology as the gospel of creation. When Francis published the encyclical Laudato Si on May 24, 2015, the religious world came to a standstill, and the secular world, curious, threw open its windows. A pope talking about ecology, global warming, environmental responsibility? It was like seeing a pastor climbing to the pulpit with dirt in his hands and wind in his hair. But what few understood right away was that this was not just an environmental manifesto, it was a true theological cry. Inspired by the mysticism of St. Francis of Assisi, the Pope proposed a revolutionary concept, integral ecology, a perspective that connects care for the environment with care for the poor, the excluded, and the future. Because, as he said with disconcerting clarity, the cry of the earth and the cry of the poor are the same, the encyclical spared no one. It denounced predatory economic systems, insatiable consumerism, and the throwaway culture that treated people as objects and forests as obstacles. And there, amidst almost poetic reflections on the beauty of creation, Francis cut deep. He called what the world called progress a sin. His language was imagistic, pulsating, almost cinematic. "This common home is cracking," he wrote. "The world groans like a woman in labor." He compared the planet to a weeping sister, a poor man groaning, a garden turned into a garbage dump. It was pure personification, and not surprisingly, it touched even those who had never set foot in a church. But his words, although applauded by many, also set off alarm bells. Politicians were suspicious, businessmen were irritated, and within the church itself, some accused him of meddling where he shouldn't. But he didn't back down. He kept planting ideas, concerns, seeds of a new era, and every gesture of his seemed to say, "Saving the earth is saving ourselves." And while the Pope spoke of the planet as a wounded body, the church itself began to writhe inside, because not everyone was ready for this new way of evangelizing. And some scandals, hushed up for years, would begin to emerge with force, like wounds that finally refused to heal. Scandals, pain, and internal wounds. The brightness of the cross does not erase the shadows behind the altar. And Francis knew this from the first day he wore white. But there were wounds within the church that did not bleed only in silence. They bled in muffled cries, ignored letters, truths hidden under tons of incense and complicit silence. And when the cases of sexual abuse came to light again, the Pope found himself facing what was perhaps the greatest challenge of his pontificate. The allegations came from far and wide: the United States, Ireland, Germany, Chile, France, and each one carried the weight of decades of pain, of destroyed trust, of broken lives. These were not just crimes, they were betrayals. And while the press pressed and the victims demanded answers, Francis was forced to descend into the depths of the institution he loved, and there he found what he himself called the shame of the church. He created laws, toughened penalties, excommunicated priests, forced bishops to resign. He called summits, met victims face to face, cried with them, asked for forgiveness. But nothing, absolutely nothing, seemed to be enough in the face of the monstrosity of the events. On some occasions, he was criticized for not acting quickly enough. On others, for trusting too much in figures who later turned out to be complicit in the horror. Even so, he did not run away. He did not outsource the pain. He carried it as if it were his own. In 2018, during a visit to Chile, he faced fierce protests. He asked for public forgiveness, and upon returning to Rome, he called for an investigation that would change the course of the church in the country. His face already showed the marks of the weight, not the weight of the crown, but the weight of the tears that accumulated on his shoulders. And each new case, each new name revealed, was a cracked mirror before his mission to renew the faith. How could he offer mercy to a body full of open wounds? How could he heal if the illness was internal? How could he evangelize if his own house was crumbling from within? But even so, Francis continued. Like a doctor who refuses to abandon a patient in a coma, like a gardener who insists on planting even when the earth already seems dead. And it was precisely in this spirit that he began to face another enemy, one that no one could hide behind veils or secret documents, time itself, which was beginning to collect its debt from the body, and reveal the fragility of a pope who did not want to stop. The weight of the years and the fragility of the body time, that invisible sculptor, began to draw deeper wrinkles on Francis's face. That firm, hurried step of the first apparitions was replaced by a slower, more careful gait, like someone walking with the whole world on their shoulders. His voice remained firm, but his body was already practicing silences. His breathing became shorter. His gestures were more restrained. The Pope poet began to write with less ink and more pauses. In July 2021, the news came like a contained thunderclap. Francis would undergo delicate colon surgery. He underwent surgery at the Gemelli Hospital in Rome, and for the first time the world saw the white cassock under the fluorescent lights of an operating room. There were days of apprehension, rumors, speculation. Was he resigning? Was he preparing to leave? He left the hospital smiling, but his eyes, those do not lie. Soon after, pain in his knees appeared, forcing him to use a wheelchair. Masses in a sitting position, limited travel, walking sticks, pauses in speeches. Still, his refusal to slow down surprised even those closest to him. "You govern with your head, not with your legs," he once said, laughing and struggling. But it was obvious. His body was taking its toll, and the clock of biology did not respect even the papal mitre. In 2023 and 2024, frequent hospitalizations reignited the debate about a possible resignation, a decision that, since Benedict XVI, had ceased to be taboo. Francis, however, was categorical. He did not want to abandon ship in a storm. He would only step down when he felt he could no longer love with gestures. Until then, even in pain, he would carry on. And it was in this context, between crutches and murmurs, that attention turned to the afterlife. Not the spiritual afterlife, but the institutional one. After all, if Francis weakened, who would come next? What ideas would survive his tired body? The succession, until then distant, now walked beside him like a persistent shadow, a shadow that did not threaten him, but whispered, and what it said would begin to gain volume in the secret corridors of the Vatican. The succession that whispers through the corridors of the Vatican in the heart of Rome, where every stone breathes history, and every statue seems to listen. Whispers are growing. They are not prayers or songs. They are murmurs of expectation, because Pope Francis is still there, present, lucid, smiling between pauses and diagnoses. But time does not wait, and the succession, inevitable as the sunset, begins to insinuate itself through the corridors of the Curia, like a tense breeze that no one can ignore. Cardinals circulate with more attentive looks. Meetings become less formal, more strategic. Names begin to emerge behind the scenes. Bets are made in silence. Alliances are suggested with handshakes that are too long. After all, this is not just about choosing a new leader. It is about deciding the direction of a 2,000-year-old institution. And this near future carries a dilemma. Francis has planted the seeds of a synodal church, open, decentralized, poor in appearance but rich in mercy. But have these seeds germinated enough to survive the wind that comes next? Or will they be uprooted by forces that prefer the polished past to the imperfect present? The shadow of succession is not a threat, it is continuity, and Francis himself knows this. That is why, with the serenity of those who know the weight of eternity, he has been carefully preparing the ground. He appoints cardinals from forgotten regions, listens more than he speaks, and bets on young faces from the periphery of the world. He does not want to just be remembered. He wants the spirit of his papacy to continue breathing in the next. But the mystery remains. Who will be next? A conservative who will stop the current? A progressive who will advance with greater force? Or someone unexpected like he was, who will change everything without announcing anything? In the meantime, Francis remains there. Fragile, yes, but whole, observing, blessing, opening paths that he himself may not travel, but that one day will lead the Church to a place where compassion is stronger than dogma. And if this story touched you in any way, inspired you, or made you see the Pope in a new light, like the video, share it with those you love, and don't forget to follow the channel. Here, each story is a bridge, each word is a candle, and each click of yours is another step on this journey of faith, humanity, and hope.